Hi guys, welcome back to my back porch. So if you remember in our last video, I kind of gave you guys an introduction into taxonomy, and we kind of dove deeper into the classification of animals and the different groups of animals that we have. And so today I'm going to dive deeper into one of the classes we haven't really talked about yet. So if you remember when I was talking about what we are as humans, I said we were in domain Eukarya, we were in kingdom Animalia, we were in phylum Chordata, and then we were in class Mammalia. So we're actually going to leave the Mammalia class, and we are going to talk about a different class called Chondrichthyes. And so these Chondrichthyes is going to contain our sharks, rays, skates, and chimeras. Mostly what I'm going to be focused on is actually a subclass, and it's called Elasmobranchi. And so our elasmobranchs are going to be our sharks, rays, and skates. So you guys probably already know what some sharks are, but rays and skates are oftentimes confused, and a lot of people have never even heard of a skate. Skates are actually really close to stingrays in appearance. The biggest difference is their barb. So this is basically two compared to each other. So this is a stingray and this is a skate. And so stingrays are going to have the stinging barb on their tail, whereas our skates are not. So we know that stingrays get that name because they have that barb on their tail. A lot of people think it's going to be at the very tip of their tail, but usually it's not. Usually, depending on the species, it's going to be either about halfway down their tail or all the way at the base of their body is where you're going to find that barb. So that barb is used for defense only, pretty much, so you can't really use it for anything else. It's not good for hunting because it's kind of hard to hunt from behind, right? So that barb is used for defense, and it's definitely something that they're going to save as a last resort. So depending on the species is going to determine the size of the barb. So really large stingrays can have a pretty large barb, and smaller stingrays can have a fairly small barb. But either way, they're no fun to come in contact with. And so the way that we usually come into contact with those stingers or those barbs is that we accidentally step on these guys, because these guys like to be buried in sand. And so while we're walking into the water, a lot of times we'll accidentally step on top of them. And so one of the easiest ways to prevent yourself from getting stung by a stingray is doing what we call the stingray shuffle. And that just means as you're walking into the water there, you want to shuffle your feet. And so instead of taking big steps like this, you want to shuffle your feet instead. And so that helps kick up some sand and also causes a lot of vibration. So if there is a stingray buried in the sand nearby you, it's going to feel those vibrations and it's going to try and swim away and not get stepped on. So that way it doesn't waste its barb on you when it could use it for a real threat down the road. Because when a stingray uses its barb, it usually, depending on the species and depending on their age, it can take up to a year for it to grow back. And so for that whole year, it's going to be absolutely defenseless if they use their barb on you accidentally. So they're definitely going to try and get away from you rather than come and attack you. So it's definitely defense only, not much for attack. So the other members of this elasmobranch group are going to be our sharks. And so something really cool about sharks is that there's a lot of variety in what they can look like and what they do and what they eat and their size. So there's about 500 or so species of sharks. And so usually when we think of them, we think of the really big ones with the big teeth, like our great white and our hammerhead. But there's also really small sharks. So there's hundreds of species of sharks that don't grow over 2 feet long, so they can be really small as well. So there's the smallest species of shark, which is actually a pygmy shark, and that's only going to be about 8 inches long. So they can be really small. But then we also know that they can be pretty big too. So the largest fish in the ocean is going to be a whale shark. They get that name partially because they are large like whales, and also because they kind of eat like whales too. So we think of sharks usually as being pretty voracious predators who will, eat and tear apart all kinds of things. But they can also be filter feeders. So the largest species of shark is a whale shark, and their mouths can be really, really wide. So they can be wide enough for us as human beings to even fit inside of. But something cool about what these whale sharks is they are filter feeders, so they're going to be feeding on really small planktonic organisms floating up in the surface of the water column there. And they're going to take big gulps of water, and they're going to kind of strain out those small particles of food and eat that instead. So even though you could fit into a whale shark's mouth, their esophagus is actually only about this big around. So even though you could fit in its mouth, you can't fit down its throat, because that throat is designed to swallow really small prey items, not big ones like you. So even our largest sharks are some of our least dangerous sharks. There's also another species of shark with a really big mouth that's also a filter feeder. So these guys are called basking sharks. I'm going to try and find you guys a picture really quick, because these guys are really cool. So here's a picture of our whale sharks. So they are easily distinguishable by these spots on their back here. So they've got those nice white spots. And then, like I said, they've got these really big mouths, but even these little fish here are too big for them to eat. So they are not actually after those fish. They're going to be after much smaller food items. But like I said, The basking shark is another really cool shark with a really big mouth that's going to be a filter feeder. And so these guys are going to take these giant gulps of water, and they actually have little ridges on their throat here that help them to filter out those food items that they want and kind of let that water kind of go through. So yeah, so there's lots of variety in sharks, and some of our biggest sharks that might be thought of as the most dangerous are actually some of the most harmless species. So one of the things that people think of a lot of times when it comes to sharks is their teeth, right? Those big scary teeth. So like I was talking about, some of them are filter feeders, and they have different shaped teeth than some of our more voracious predators, some of our more voracious species of sharks. So a lot of sharks are going to have these kinds of teeth here, so they're going to have really sharp teeth that grow in these rows like this. So this is an actual shark jaw, so this is really what it looks like inside their mouths, and they'll have rows and rows of teeth, so as teeth fall out when they're hunting, they're going to be able to replace them immediately. So that's really important. If you are a big shark out in the water, you need to make sure that you have plenty of teeth to catch that food with, right? So a lot of sharks' teeth are going to look like that. We do have shark teeth that grow really long and really pointy, kind of like needles. Those teeth are good for catching really fast fish, so they're going to be able to grab onto them really fast and easily. And then we have some shark teeth that are more serrated and wide, and those are really good for tearing things. So if they eat larger prey items, being able to tear off pieces is really important for them, because sharks don't chew even though they have all those teeth. They've got to just bite off pieces and swallow them whole. So when we talk about rays and skates, usually those guys are going to have crushing plates instead of real teeth. So those are going to be mostly flattened plates that have like ridges, and they use those to kind of crush up their food. So they'll crush up, fish or crab shells or shells that contain clams or oysters and stuff like that. Another really cool thing about sharks is they are covered with scales that are really specific to them, and so they have what are known as placoid scales. Another name for these are actually called dermal denticles. So if you kind of break that word apart, so dermal means skin, and denticles refers to teeth. So their skin is kind of covered in teeny tiny teeth almost, and so if you were to touch a shark, they actually feel really rough like sandpaper. And so this is kind of what a placoid scale looks like. So if you want to compare it to some fish scales, usually they're a little more round, but these guys have these specialized placoid scales, and so that can actually help them to become more hydrodynamic as well. So their scales can help them to kind of push the water along their bodies and make them have less drag as they're trying to swim, which is another thing that helps them to stay up in the water column as well, which is really important if you are living in the water like a shark. So a lot of fish, bony fish, have what are known as swim bladders, and so those are just pockets of air inside of them that help them to float in the water column. But most sharks aren't going to have that. Instead, what they are going to do is they're going to utilize a couple different things in conjunction with each other to help them be a little bit more buoyant. So if you watched our video when we were talking about density and floating and stuff like that, we said that oil is less dense than water, and so it's able to float, whereas water would sink. And so one of the things that sharks have is they have a really oily liver that takes up the most of their internal body, and so that can help them float in the water column. They also have these dermal denticles that make them hydrodynamic, and that paired with their pectoral fins, so that's their fins that would be in the place of where you'd think arms would be. Those are kind of working like airplane wings, so they're able to really pick up on lift and allow them to stay upright in that water column. Another thing that these guys have is a cartilaginous skeleton, so that's something that's really important to the elasmobranch group, so all of them are going to be categorized by that because they're also called cartilaginous fishes. So they don't have a true skeleton. Instead, they have that skeleton that's made out of cartilage instead of bone. So that is a lot less heavy than bone is, and so it allows them to float a little better than if they had a true skeleton like we do. So another interesting thing about our elasmobranch group here is has to do with their reproduction. So something that's kind of cool about sharks is that they have what is called sexual dimorphism, and rays have it too, where you can kind of tell boys from girls. They have a structure called a clasper, which you can kind of see on our little picture of our skate here. So those little appendages there are used for reproduction, and they're only found on males, so you can always tell a male from a female. And something kind of cool about these guys is, depending on the shark species, they've been seen to do all three kinds of reproduction or birthing practices. So us as mammals, we are what is known as viviparous. That means that we give live birth, and that when we are pregnant, that developing fetus is going to be attached to us with an umbilical cord, and so that's how we're going to provide nutrients as that baby is growing. But then there's also oviparous, which is when an offspring comes from an egg, and then when it's inside that egg, it's feeding off of a yolk. So sharks can do either one depending on the species. But then there's also a third one that's kind of in between those two, so that when the baby is born, it comes out of its mother already alive and free swimming, but when it is inside of its mother's stomach, it's not feeding off of an umbilical cord, it's instead attached to a yolk. So it's kind of like an internal egg, so then it's born alive, but when it's inside of its mother's belly, it's not feeding from the mother directly, it's feeding from a yolk like an egg. And so sharks, depending on the species, have seen to do all three kinds. There are species of sharks that have been seen to, once they hatch inside of their mom, so the ovoviviparous species, they will hatch some before others, and they've been seen to actually eat other offspring, so siblings or unhatched eggs, they will eat them inside of the womb. So some species only give birth to 2 or 3 pups, and while they were inside of their mom's stomach, they ate all their brothers and sisters, which is pretty crazy. But depending on the species kind of determines which method they're going to use and how many offspring they'll have at a time. So some can have 2 or 3 at a time, some can have 10 to 20 at a time, and some can have even more than that, so dozens and dozens at a time. It really depends on the method and the species. So if we're talking about shark anatomy, one of the other things that really stands out to people is that dorsal fin. So that's going to be their fin on their back, right? And so everyone's seen those movies where you're swimming in the water and at the surface you see that little dorsal fin sticking out, right? And so a lot of people actually end up mistaking dolphins for sharks for this reason, because dolphins like to swim close to the surface as well, and they both have that dorsal fin on their back. One of the easiest ways to tell the two apart, if you only have a little bit of a glimpse of them from above the water, is looking at the way that they're swimming. So sharks have a caudal fin that's going to move side to side like this, whereas dolphins are going to move up and down like this. So dolphins are usually going to be swimming in a pattern where they surface and they'll come back down, and this is called a porpoising motion. So they'll come up and come down and they'll swim like this, whereas sharks are going to be doing this. So if you see their dorsal fin and you also see their caudal fin sticking up behind, that's going to be a shark, not a dolphin, right? And so another thing these guys have are those pectoral fins. So we were talking about the fins that help them with lift. They also have pelvic fins and anal fins, and then for the most part, most of them actually have 2 dorsal fins. So they'll have a big one in front and then a secondary one in the back. Almost all sharks have that, but there's a couple that don't, and that can be a nice way to help identify them as well. Another thing that oftentimes gets confused with a shark is there are some fish species that look a lot like sharks, and so something you can always look for if you're unsure if you're looking at a shark or a fish is their gills. So sharks are going to have gill slits on the side of their head there, so it's going to be 5 or 6 slits usually on the side of their head, whereas a fish is going to have a gill covering called an operculum. So if it's just one big long flap, that's going to be its gill operculum on a bony fish, but couple gill slits on the side are going to be the gill slits of a shark. So one common misconception I hear about sharks a lot is that sharks have to constantly swim in order to breathe. That's true only of a couple species of shark. Usually your open water sharks that do a lot of really fast swimming. But we also have bottom dwellers that are going to sit kind of on the ocean floor and not move a whole lot. And so those guys obviously still have to breathe as well. So the sharks that are going to want to continuously swim to breathe are going to be the ones that utilize ram ventilation. So they are going to be pumping water or forcing water over their gills as they're swimming through the water. So sometimes they'll open up their mouths to help that water kind of pass over their gills. And so those guys are going to want to keep swimming to keep that water moving over their gills. But then the ones who are more benthic or bottom dwelling sharks, these guys can utilize something called buccal pumping, where they will actually open and close their mouth to help push that water over their gills instead. A lot of them are also going to have spiracles, like a lot of our rays are going to have little holes close to their eyes, and those spiracles have skin over them that can kind of open and close that opening to help push that water through their gills as they're kind of sitting on the bottom. So like I was saying, out in the wild we have about 500 species of sharks, but unfortunately about 80% of those sharks are endangered, and also unfortunately human beings are the main cause of that. So every year humans are killing about 100 million sharks, and we do that for several reasons. Some people do it for food because things like shark fin soup is just considered a delicacy in some countries. People kill them for their skin, and then some people kill them just because they think that they're scary and they don't like them. Unfortunately, these guys are really important to our ecosystem, so killing them is detrimental to more than just the shark species. One of the most important roles that these guys have in our oceans is that these guys are really good at population control, so they're going to be eating a bunch of fish and squid and crabs and stuff like that, and that prevents those populations from becoming too numerous, and then those can end up taking over ecosystem niches that other animals are supposed to occupy. And then these guys are also really good at helping keep those fish populations healthy. And so these guys tend to be kind of lazy feeders, so they're not going to go after the strongest, fastest, best fish. They're going to kind of go after the ones that are weaker or sick or not really thriving because it's an easier meal. So they tend to help the population as a whole become a more healthy population of fish, and because they don't allow those sickly fish to survive and reproduce. So it's really important for us to keep those shark species alive. So even though you think sharks might be big and scary, if you think about it, you guys are constantly swimming in the ocean with those sharks. They live there, they're always there, even if you don't see them. And how many times have you been attacked? Not that often. You guys actually have a higher chance of dying while you're taking a selfie than getting attacked by a shark. Isn't that crazy? Alright guys, so that's all I have for you today. So if you guys have any questions about sharks or elasmobranchs or anything, feel free to drop them below and I'll answer them the best I can. And hopefully moving forward, we're going to kind of dive into some other groups of animals. So be on the lookout for those videos. But until then, hope you guys have a good week and you're staying healthy and you're staying happy. And we can't wait to open up and see you guys really soon. Bye!